Hey guys, George at SoundTraxx here, and this week we're going to do an installation in this Broadway Limited Mikado 282 locomotive. Now, the principles we're going to discuss are actually applicable to any of the Broadway Limited locomotives. No matter which type you have, a lot of their sound systems are very similar, and a lot of the internal components are going to be exactly the same. So we're going to go ahead and get started, but first let's take a listen of this locomotive after we get it out of the box. Let's listen in as we take this thing for a spin using the stock sound system. Now you can kind of hear how some of those sounds are very generic, very randomly played, and also really don't have much to do with the operation of the locomotive. They're just random noises. So let's take a look and see as we upgrade this Broadway Limited Mikado 282. Okay, so we're here at the workbench, and the next thing we need to do is to start disassembling our model so we can put in our Tsunami2. So first we need to separate the locomotive away from the tender. So we're going to undo the drawbar, and you'll see that there's a cable that runs out of the tender and into this circuit board on the locomotive. We're simply going to gently tug at that, and you want to make sure you get all the wires gripped evenly. Boy, this one's in there tight. There we go. Now you can see I've got that plug pulled out of the locomotive there. So we're going to take the locomotive, we're going to set it aside for the moment. Now we're going to inspect the plug, make sure everything looks good, make sure all the wires are still in good condition. Now we're going to take the shell off the tender. So on this one, there's no screws. It simply pops off. So we can take that, set it aside. Now we have exposed our circuit board. We have the wires that are coming into the circuit board, and then we have our two speakers mounted there on the floor of the tender. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start moving some of this stuff out of the way. So I'm going to grab my Phillips head screwdriver, and we're going to unscrew this circuit board off of the mount. Grab a pair of tweezers to get that screw out of the way. And there's another one right here. And you can see that circuit board just lifts right off. So now we have two things that we need to take into account. And these are the wires coming from the speakers and the wires going to your track power. Now we see another two screws here that we can simply remove this platform / weight out of the way. This way we can identify which speakers or which wires are which, and which track power leads go from where to where. So we see this front one, the gray and the black wires are our track pickup, and the red and black are for our speakers. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab a wire cutter, and we're just going to cut these wires to give us as much length as we can for our track leads. And then we're going to go ahead and take this red and black wires. We're going to trace, find out where they go. They go right here to this connector. So we can go ahead and unplug for the moment. And we can take that whole sound system out. Now we're going to rewire these speakers up, so you don't have to cut the plug if you want to save it for a future project or something like that that you're working on. So in this space right here, we're going to go ahead and take those speakers and we're going to wire them up in series. So that's going to be the next step. Let me get prepared with the materials we need, and I'll be right back. Okay, so one thing I want to point out is that these two speakers are wired in parallel, and what that means is that the positive lead goes to the positive lead on both speakers, and the negative wire goes to the negative lead on both speakers. Now, for the best sound in the Tsunami 2, and also to get the amplifier to where it's working well, we need to rewire these up in parallel. Now, I want to point out, in this decoder installation, we're going to be using our TSU-2200 for Steam 2, and this is part number 884007. Now, we're going to be using the two purple wires here for our speaker, and then we have one extra purple wire to jumper between the two speakers, and that's how we're going to do parallel. We're also going to add in a SoundTraxx current keeper. We're going to do that here in a later step. So first, we need to get the decoder out of the package here. And I'm just simply going to trim along the edge of the plastic. And I'm going to pull my decoder out. Now, one thing I do want to point out is in this bag header, there's a lot of good basic information that you're going to be able to use to get started quickly with your Tsunami 2. So I would recommend you take some time, pop these staples and open it up and read through it, including a wire diagram and everything else that you may need to get a quick start. Now, all of the usage and things that you can do with the decoder are highlighted in our Tsunami 2 Steam User's Guide, and that's what you're going to want to look for all the features and explain how all the features work in the decoder. So I'm going to go ahead and set this aside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to locate my two purple wires out of the TSU-2200. All right, so now I've got these. So I'm going to turn on my soldering iron. And now what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to trim these a little short because I don't need to go very far. And I can use one of the leads of this wire also as the jumper wire. So go ahead and get our wire cutters and wire strippers. We're going to cut these a little short. Now I'm going to go ahead and strip the end of the wire just a little bit here. You can see how easy that is with a wire stripper that's pre-gauged, ready to go. It's a pretty quick, easy process. Now we're going to twist the ends of the wire here just to make sure that all the strands are collected. We're going to take our flux. Now this is flux made by Chip Quick, SMD 291. I get this at DigiKey. It's about $12, I think, the last time I checked. So this is really good because with this syringe application, you can be very precise on how much flux you're putting onto each of your joints. And so you can be very small with it, or if you have a bigger task, then you can put a little bit more. Now, one thing I do have is little bits of solder that you can have. If you have a roll, you can lay it out. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my soldering iron. I'm going to clean the tip off. Grab a little bit of solder off of the end of the wire here, or end of the solder. Now you can see I have a ball of solder on the end of the iron. And I'm just barely going to touch the end, and there, that end of the wire is tinned. Now I'm going to do it again to the other. There you go. Now those wires are tinned. Now we can shorten these so that way we don't have a whole lot of exposed wire on the end. So we have to take our cutter. We're just going to cut a little bit. So we've got probably about a 1/16 or a 32nd of an inch of the wire exposed. Now the next step we'll want to do is remove the wires off of the speakers. One thing I do want to point out is they've got these foam little blocks on top of the speakers here, and that's what helps mount the speaker in place. When the weight is placed over top of the speakers, it helps hold them down. So we don't want to remove these foam blocks. So if any of the foam block is over the wires, you just can simply pull it back a little bit so that way we've got access to the speaker wires. So like I've told you in a past video, I'm going to take a tool and we're going to put the handle on the speaker to make sure that the magnet doesn't jump up and try to attach itself to my soldering iron. And then we're just going to use a standard pair of tweezers, and we're going to grip the wire, or wires in this case, and we're simply going to use the tweezers to pull the speaker wires up and away. So there's the red wires, and there we go, there's the black wires. So my first speaker is free. Now we'll go ahead and do that again with the second speaker here, and we've got, there's one, and there's number two. Now remember, speaker wires can be saved for other purposes if you so choose later on. Again, I like to keep the connectors and things like that I find, because you never know when you're going to do it. These wires I think are too small for me to use for anything, so I'm going to toss them. Okay, so now we need to wire our speakers in series. So I'm going to take this extra pair of side cutters, and I'm going to lay the handle over this, so that way I've got a smaller distance between the two. Now when you're doing this, you want to make sure to align the speakers up the same, so that way your positive is always going to be on the same side and your negative is going to be on the same side, regardless of how they orient in the model. So now we're going to take our pre-tinned wire, and the two purple wires, for what we're doing, positive and negative really doesn't matter all that much, but just be sure to pick one and be consistent with it. So in this case, I'm going to pick this to be the wire that's going to go on first, and we're going to attach this here to this first terminal. So I'm going to take a little bit of solder flux. I'm going to put it on the terminal here to make sure my solder goes on where it's supposed to. And we're going to put a little bit on each of these terminals here just to make sure. Alright, so now I'm going to take my soldering iron, clean it off. I'm going to put a little solder on the end of it. And then we're going to go ahead and make this solder joint. And just like that, that wire is soldered. Now the other side, this other speaker wire, we're going to take this and attach it to the negative lead on the other speaker. So again, we're going to get just a little bit of solder on the end. And take that wire, we're going to hold it in place. And there we go. So now we need to connect the two speakers here in the middle. So to do that, we're going to take one of our small pieces of purple wire, and again, the color of the wire is somewhat irrelevant, but it's good to have color coding so that you know what you're doing, so if you ever have to go back into it later on. So we're going to simply run it from this terminal to the next one on the other speaker. So again, we have to do exactly what we did before. So we're going to strip and tin the ends of these wires. Okay, and put a little bit, tiny bit of flux on the ends of these. Make sure that the solder flows onto it and into the joint. There we go. Now we're going to take our soldering iron, put a little solder on the end of it. Now we're simply going to allow the solder to flow onto the connection. Now again, we can shorten these to make sure that we don't have a whole lot of exposed wire, because guys, when you're working on models, exposed wire is a terrible thing and asking for problems. So now that we've got our wire stripped down to about a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch, again, I'm going to grab my tweezers and we're going to hold that up. Now remember, we've already put some flux on here, so we just need to get a new little bit of solder. Now we're going to put the wire in place, and we're simply going to solder it. And there we go. Now we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So let's get a little bit of solder. Grab our wire, put it down in place, and we're going to solder it And we're done. So now you can see how these wires, these speakers have been wired. They're what's called series, which means they're in series, one to the other, and then back to the source. So now we can simply mount these back in place. So we can simply put these speakers back into the housing. Now we're going to take our weight that we had before, put it over top here. And you want to make sure you don't pinch any wires or get anything in where it shouldn't be. Okay, now we're going to take our screws that we took out, grab our Phillips head screwdriver, and we're going to put these two screws back in place. And there you go. Now with that done, we can simply mount the decoder right here on top with a piece of double stick foam tape. So let's go ahead and grab that. And this is just some 3M double-sided foam tape that you can pick up at any Walmart. And we're going to just cut a piece about as long as the decoder. So we're going to be about that long right there. And it comes in different sizes, so you can trim and cut this as you need for your application. So we're going to put a little piece of this double stick foam tape right there. Now we're going to use our knife to peel the backing up. And that comes out of the way. Now we can simply mount our decoder in place. And again, take care not to get any of the wires trapped, anything that you're going to need. And we can mount that right there. So these are for extra lights. We're not going to be using that in this installation. So these wires can be cut short. So now I'm going to take my tape and I'm going to mount it to hold these wires in place so that they're protected and out of the way. But I'm also going to take my speaker wires and tuck them underneath this piece of tape as well to help make sure that they're not interfering with the reinstallation of the shell when we're done. So now you can see how that's tucked in nice and neat and clean. Everything's accessible. Now we're going to attach these wires on the front of the decoder to our wire harness that we removed with the circuit board. So now we're going to take the 7-wire harness that we unplugged out of the locomotive, and you're going to see that we have this wire harness. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to cut the entire harness out. We're going to set that aside. And now we have our locomotive harness. Now, once we have our 7-wire harness and we're ready to connect these wires to our harness, the first thing we need to do, though, is we need to figure out which of these 7 wires are used for which purpose. Now, we obviously can't guess in this locomotive. So we're going to take the tender aside. We're going to take our harness and set it aside. Now we're going to open up the locomotive. And we're going to find out which wires in that connector do what. So first we're going to disassemble. So first off, there's one screw right here under the pilot truck. We're going to remove that screw. And we have it loose. So we're going to grab it with our tweezers and pull it out. Now we're going to take these 2 screws here under the cab. And there's 2 of them, one on each side of the drawbar connector there. And we're going to just unscrew those. And we're going to take those screws out. And you'll notice they're different than the one that we just removed under the pilot truck. So you can set them together. Just make sure you remember which purpose are for each screw. Now, once we have our locomotive unscrewed, we can take the body shell off. So we can just simply lift off the top half, and they're going to find there's a 2-pin connector holding the headlight wires into this small little circuit board. Now we can take a pair of tweezers or pliers or just grab it and remove that. And what that does is that will allow us to take our boiler and all of this aside and free it up so that we can work on the chassis. Now, looking at the chassis, I can see on the back here, we'll move it a little closer to the camera. Now you can see on the back here where all these our terminals are labeled for what their purposes are. So we have motor, track, motor, motor, and track, and in the middle we actually have ground and FL for headlight, and then sense for the sensor. Now the sensor they're referring to is Broadway Limited uses a magnet with a reed switch right here to trigger this reed switch so that the decoder that they use can identify the rotations of the motor. Now on our Tsunami2 we don't need any of that. We can actually read the rotations of the motor without having to have any special fancy unusual circuitry. So to help simplify things inside of this locomotive, we're going to remove this small little circuit board here, and that will free up these wires coming back. We can identify our track pickups to make sure which rail goes to which side. Our motor leads, we're going to confirm that. And then we can actually desolder the wires here and run them directly to mount up with the headlight in the locomotive. So to do that, we're going to take our multimeter and just verify everything. And our multimeter here, we're going to set it over here to test for continuity. And this is this little symbol with an arrow and a line next to it. And so anytime that the wires are not continuous, you'll see that there's a 1 or an infinite resistance. But then when I touch the two leads together, you can see how that changes to 0. So what that's doing is that's telling us that there is perfect continuity there between the two. So we can do that and verify which side of the rail are which. Now, of course, we can assume that this side of the locomotive is going to be this rail pickup. And most likely that's a safe assumption, but it's always good to take a minute and verify that and test. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to take this track terminal here, we're going to touch it, and then we're going to touch the other terminal to the wheel, and you can see in our meter here, that we have perfect continuity between that. So when I'm testing this track and this lead right here, you can see that we have perfect continuity. So of course that would seem to reason that when I go to the other side, track to the wheels on the other side, now you can see that they're continuous as well. Now when it comes to the motor leads, we're going to assume the top one is positive. So again, we just want to make sure. So looking at our diagram here, this side here would be the positive motor. So we're going to go motor plus to there. And you're going to see that we have a 0 resistance. So that means that wire is continuous as well. And you can work your way through. Now, knowing where this connection is, there's going to be a gray wire, a black wire, and a brown wire that we're going to remove. So to get started, we're going to go ahead and take these two screws out, and we're going to remove this little circuit board because again we no longer need it. Now if you want to save the screws for in your toolbox, you can do that. Otherwise we will not need them again here. So now that we've removed the screws here, what we're going to do is we're going to test these wires to make sure they're connected to the terminals that we need for our ground, which we're going to make our blue positive for the function, and then the FL for our headlight function. The sensors wire we're going to remove. So we just need to verify which wires here we need to remove. So in doing that, we're going to come over here with our multimeter, and we're going to test the ground wire to each of these terminals. Now this ground wire is the black wire. So we can safely say that that wire will run to the positive lead of my LED. Now that means the next one, the FL, we're going to find out which terminal that goes to. And that goes to our gray wire. And so knowing that, now the gray wire can go to my headlight. That means this brown wire, which is labeled as the sensor wire, is continuous. So we can remove that wire completely from the equation. So with all three wires exposed right here, we're going to go ahead and cut, or you can desolder, whichever you prefer. Now this brown wire we're going to trace, and we're going to pull it out from underneath this foam insulation. Now that we have that removed, so we can see the brown wire goes to this terminal right here. So once we free the wire up completely and take it out of the tangle, we can now grab our soldering iron, and we're going to desolder this one terminal. So that wire comes off. We can stash that. So now with that done, we have all the other connections made that we need to make. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this black, remember this is our V positive, and we're going to take the gray and we're going to attach it to the terminals on the LED. Now, you're going to notice that there's a black and a gray wire. But we need to confirm which wire goes to which. So again, we're going to remove our plug because I don't have a plug there anymore. Now we're going to strip and tin the ends of these two wires with our wire cutters. We'll need a little bit more than that. Alright, so now we've got these wires disconnected. So now we just need to test the polarity for the headlight. So I'm going to move this over to the side for a minute. So with these two wires exposed, I'm going to get a LED tester. Now this is a simple 9-volt battery that has one of the connectors on it. And in line with one of the leads, you're going to see that we've soldered a 1000 ohm resistor. And then you put some alligator clips on the end of it. Alternatively, you can take a standard 9-volt battery also and solder one of the leads with a 1000 ohm resistor. Again, all we're doing is just testing the LED. And what this will do is this will help us verify the correct polarity. So if black is the positive lead, and we're going to use that from the blue wire, then if this maintains, then the gray wire should be the negative lead. And once we connect, you can see that my LED is illuminated. So we can safely say that black goes to black and gray goes to gray in this particular instance. So now we're going to solder and make those connections. So I'll be right back. Okay, so now that we've got our wires soldered, now the last thing we want to do before we button the locomotive up is remember these terminals on the end where the connector goes to are labeled, and we verified that they are accurate. So therefore what we want to do is we want to make a small little test or cheat sheet on an old business card or scrap piece of paper, something like that, and we want to mark the wires as far as their purpose. Now this one is the one that was used with the sensor, so I put an X here, but this would be a great opportunity if you wanted to add something like, say, a firebox light or class lights or something like that. You have a free wire and then you would still tie into the same V+ common. Now once we've done this, we have the concern to make sure we have our orientation correct. So what I normally will do is I'll put a small arrow that will point towards the front of the locomotive, so that way whenever I'm using the card as a cheat sheet, I know what the orientation is, so that way I make sure the wires are done correctly. So now we're pretty much done with the locomotive side of it, so we can button this thing up and get back to putting in the decoder. Okay, so now that we're focused back on the tender, what we want to do first is test the orientation of the plug to make sure that this plug matches the wire accordingly. Now we can do that by simply plugging it in, since we know which way it fits. So now the plug's in, we know it sits in there properly. So now we can simply take that, and we want to leave about 1.5 inches or so, maybe 2 inches outside of the tender so that we have enough room to plug in and unplug our locomotive. So from that regard, you can kind of see here how the wires overlap a little bit, and that is perfectly fine. So what we can do in this case is we can actually cut the wires somewhere short or leave them a little bit long, which will be fine too in the end, so that way we have enough play, and we can always pull this out a little further and push it back in as needed. So what I normally will do is I will find a good place, and we're looking, so I've got this wire harness sticking out quite a bit in front here, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut all these wires at about this length right there. And what that does is then that means we don't have all the excess wire to deal with and contend with while we're trying to wire these last few wires up. Now again, we want to make sure we have 2 wires for our track pickups. We have a left rail and a right rail, and we want to make sure that they're oriented properly when we're tying in, so that way we don't get any cross-contamination. So this is again where you can use your multimeter to test and make sure that the gray wire is going to right rail or the left rail, and verify accordingly. Alternatively, you can look in some cases at the underside of the model. Now in this case, we can see that this axle is continuous to here, but this axle actually has a plastic insert around the axle, which would then insulate this wheel from the axle. Now the wipers are touching the axle, so we can use that as a guideline, but I would encourage you to use your multimeter just to be sure. Now again, following our wiring diagram, we're going to strip and tin the ends of each of these wires and the ends of each of these wires and make a connection. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now, and we'll be back in just a second. So now that we're done with connecting all the wires, we've made all of our connections. Now one thing I did want to point out is on this particular locomotive, I took a piece of 1/4 inch shrink tubing here and I ran all the wires through it. And the reason for that is because now I can take that piece of heat shrink tubing and glue it to the floor of the tender. Now I can move my harness in and out as needed, and it'll be nice and clean for the hole here where the wires poke through. So that way I don't have to worry about loose or errant wires running around and trying to bundle it up like a ball of spaghetti. So now that we've got all of our connections, let's go test it out. Okay guys, let's plug it in and let's take a test. So we're powering up the layout now. And we have sound. Now one thing I want to point out is there's no baffle on these speakers yet because we have not put the tender shell on, so the sounds are going to be very tinny and very weak, so don't worry about it just yet. We're just testing. So let's test the whistle. And we have our headlight turns on. Let's make sure our orientation of the motor is correct, so we're in forward. Now we're in reverse. Everything looks good. So let's go back up to the workbench, button it up, and we'll add in our current keeper. Okay, so now we're back at the workbench, so our next step is to glue the piece of shrink tubing down where we want it. Now using our same piece of scrap paper or business card, we can put a small dab of cyanoacrylate or super glue or jet glue, whatever you'd like. And then you can get a small toothpick, and what we're going to do is we're just going to take a little dab of that glue on the edge of the toothpick, and we're going to put it right here where we want to glue that shrink tubing in place. Now with just a little bit of work, so now what we're going to do is we're going to take the wires, we're going to route them under the weight, and we're going to take that shrink tubing and we're going to mount it right in that glue, and we're going to kind of hold it in place until the glue dries. Now remember, you don't want to get so much glue down there that you get glue on the wires, because that would defeat the purpose of what we're trying to do. We want to be able to make sure that this wire harness can pull in and out as needed to make sure we have the accessibility we need to get into the tender shell and be able to move that wire harness back and forth. So we're going to let that dry for a minute. We'll be right back. So we're going to take our current keeper and we're going to simply remove it from the packaging so we can trim the insulation. Again, I encourage you guys to take out the manual or the booklet that comes with it, read it, make sure you understand what it's doing. Now, one thing you will know is notice there are two pieces of shrink tubing. This is for use in case you ever need to cut the harness off, but in this installation we're not cutting it off, so we're just going to simply take those two pieces of shrink tubing and set them aside for a future project. So now we've got our current keeper. Now, one thing is the end of these current keeper shrink tubing sometimes can be a little bit off or odd shaped because the shrink tubing shrinks, so you can trim a little bit of that off if you want to make it fit a little easier. So what I'm just going to do here is I'm going to take my X-Acto knife and cut off a little bit of that excess. Now, the biggest thing is you don't want to go in and expose any of the electronics in it, so on the front side you can probably trim a little bit of this off, because again, this one kind of curved a little bit, so we can kind of trim it up a little bit, make sure it fits well, and that's good to go. That's all we need to remove. Now, on our decoder, again, the shrink tubing in some cases kind of comes over this 2-pin connector, and this is where the connector is, right here. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to score the insulation around this plug, pull it away so that we can access that plug, and then we're going to plug in the current keeper. So again, we're just going to take our knife and gently trim the insulation around this edge of this plug. Because there's no real need to go a whole lot into, you don't need to expose much more than that. So here's our exposed plug. You can kind of see how the 2-pin connector is right there. Now the 2-pin connector has an orientation, so it only fits in one way. So when we plug it in, that's all there is to it. Now we're going to get a small piece of double-sided tape, and we can actually mount that up front here so that we can actually have the decoder and the current keeper right next to each other. Now again, we don't need much tape, we're just holding it in place. So I'm just taking a small little 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch square piece of double-sided tape. I'm going to peel the backing up, and then we're simply going to take the current keeper and we're just going to secure that down. So now we have our TSU-2200 and our current keeper installed side by side. So now we can take our body shell, tuck all the wires in, make sure they're all good, and snap it back into place. Now again, we have our wire harness here, and we can adjust the length of that because we have that shrink tubing in place. So now the last thing to do is to take it into the other room. Let's take it for a final test drive. Okay, now that we've got everything together, let's power it up. Okay, and our system's up and going. Let's blow the whistle. You can already hear how much better the sound is when you have that baffle on the speaker. Now we're going to go ahead and turn on our headlight and let's verify everything. And check movement in the forward direction. Okay, we're going to check movement in the reverse direction. Everything looks good. So this is another successful installation of a SoundTraxx Tsunami2 decoder, and this will show you the things that you need to keep in mind when you're doing an upgrade to a Broadway Limited or another brand locomotive that comes with its own sound system, and some of the things you can keep in mind. Now, stay tuned for a future video where we actually set this up and we select the whistle, the bell, all the other different sounds, including the coal stoker or the auger, as we get ready to set this up for trade show demonstrations. So thanks again for tuning in, and we hope to see you guys again soon.